It's a great honor to speak to you, this distinguished gathering. Lumen Christi, association with the University of Chicago. I feel that maybe any of you could be here and I would be sitting. I do have some interesting connections with Chicago. The first, when I was very young. See, I'm young now, but I used to be very young. Growing up in a mill town, Fall River, Massachusetts, and my athletic hero was Johnny Lujack, the All-American quarterback from the University of Notre Dame. And when Johnny Lujack was drafted by the Chicago Bears and became the quarterback of the Bears, naturally I had to root for the Chicago Bears. Now what was interesting at that time was the Chicago Bears had Johnny Lujack, Sid Luckman, and Bobby Lane, all incredible quarterbacks. And that was just the L's. Sid Luckman retired, went into the Hall of Fame. Bobby Lane was traded, went into the Hall of Fame. Johnny Lujack had a couple of great years. He did everything. He played defense, offense, kicked field goals, kicked extra points, passed, ran. He led the league in scoring one year. But then he got injured, had a very short career. And since those talented trio of quarterbacks played with the Bears, they have not had a quarterback as good as any of those three in the last 60 years. And the latest casualty is Caleb Haney, who will be forgotten, I'm sure. The University of Chicago, and of course, teaching philosophy, and very much indebted to the great books program that was born at the University of Chicago. Robert Hutchins, the president, and Mortimer Adler. Hutchins was very concerned about unity, especially unity within the receding departments of the University of Chicago, and he once said that the only form of unity we have is a common heating system. Mortimer Adler was concerned about unity in a slightly different way. He once said, "I'm a Jew teaching Catholic philosophy at a Protestant institution to a group of atheists." He was in love with Thomas Aquinas, the great doctor of common sense. Now, of course, I've been for a while a Catholic teaching Catholic philosophy at a Catholic school to Catholics, and I think that was more difficult than what Mortimer Adler had to face. I have a copy of Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book, signed by Mortimer Adler. When he signed it in these big sweeping letters, Mortimer Adler, he looked at the book and he was very pleased that it seemed to be very well read. It was a very dog-eared copy. And I kind of smiled, but I didn't point out that I bought it secondhand from another person who read it very. So that's one of those books that I don't want to throw out. But now that I'm familiar with how to read a book, then I embarked on reading the works of Ayn Rand. I think I still don't know how to read a book. I'll go back to Mortimer Adler. I want to present Ayn Rand in one image. She's a fabulous phenomenon. She is a phenomenon. And there is such a striking disparity between her immense popularity and the quality of her contribution, which makes her quite a phenomenon. Atlas Shrugged, her magnum opus, has sold over 7 million copies. And there are some people who believe that this is the best-selling novel ever written on American soil. Over 7 million. Just imagine, that's almost as long as it's been since the Chicago Cubs got in the World Series. Over 7 million copies. 2009 was a particularly good year. 520,000 copies were sold. Now, she passed away in 1985. 2009, 520,000 copies of Atlas Shrugged. Each year, the Ayn Rand Institute donates 400,000 of Ayn Rand's books to high school students. There is, of course, the Objectivist newsletter, the Ayn Rand Society, There are people who call themselves Randians, and then there are the Randroids. The Randians believe that everything Ayn Rand said is true, and the Randroids believe that everything Ayn Rand said is true, and nothing that anybody else said is true. So there are the Randroids. To give you an idea of how some of her books were received, Atlas Shrugged in particular, Gore Vidal. I mean, you think Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley don't have a whole lot in common. Gore Vidal described its philosophy as nearly perfect in its immorality. But maybe the most famous review appeared in the National Review, penned by Whittaker Chambers, who found Atlas Shrugged remarkably silly and sophomoric. And then he said, out of a lifetime of reading, I can recall no other book in which a tone of overriding arrogance was so implacably sustained. Its shrillness is without reprieve. Its dogmatism is without appeal. Now, this deeply wounded Ayn Rand, as one might imagine. And Ayn Rand knew the editor of the National Review at that time, William F. Buckley, because they both had one thing in common. They were both very much opposed to communism, so they would meet in anti-communist rallies. Ayn Rand would say to William F. Buckley, "You are too intelligent to believe in God." Very, very strange kind of comment. Obviously, there were lots of intelligent people in history who did believe in God. But Ayn Rand was so mortally wounded by this review of Atlas Shrugged by Whittaker Chambers that she never wanted to meet anybody of National Review anytime, including William F. Buckley. So she would call the National Review every time she was going someplace to make sure that no one was going to be there representing National Review. And William F. Buckley said, I'm afraid we cost her a great deal of time in choreographing her life so as to avoid all of us. Ruth Chapin Blackman said that it's a polemic inadequately disguised as a novel. Some people think she really wasn't a novelist, she was simply a polemicist, and her polemics are disguised, very thinly disguised novels. Saturday Review, Helen Beale Woodward found it shot through with hatred. Granville Hicks, writing for the New York Times Book Review, said it was written out of hate. And another reviewer said, is it a novel? Is it a nightmare? Is it Superman? Like it's in the comic strip. Is it a Superman? Is it the comic strip or a Nietzschean version? She admits to having read Friedrich Nietzsche and pretty much accepted his general philosophy. One of her earlier books, she had a quotation from Nietzsche prefacing each chapter, but her editor advised her to delete that because she didn't want to be too much identified with Friedrich Nietzsche. This is just to highlight the extraordinary discrepancy between her immense popularity and the quality of her contribution. I'd like to establish some kind of coherent order to this talk, so I'd like to say a few words about 5 points in her overall thinking. First, anthropology, and then the notion of love and human relationships, the importance she attaches to reason, and then logic, and finally reality. But I've culled a few statements from her vast works to give you a sense of her spirit. And maybe this is the best way to begin presenting the mind of Ayn Rand, simply quoting her. I think these few quotations reveal, I think, the true spirit, and a very consistent spirit, of Ayn Rand. In the hopeless swamps of the not quite, the not yet, and the not at all, do not let the hero in your soul perish, and leave only frustration for the life you deserved, but never have been able to reach. It seems to me this is very appealing. A lot of people feel as though they're in a hopeless swamp. and they are reaching out but can't find anything because they have so much opposition. Nobody agrees with them. Everybody's oppressing them. Their parents are oppressing them. The government's oppressing them. Schools are oppressing them. And they're reaching out, but they're unable to find what they really want. And so she's appealing to people who feel down and hopeless. And she says, I believe in you. You can do it. Right? In the hopeless, but of course it's hyperbole. If it's hopeless swamps, I think you're finished. If in the hopeless swamps of the not quite, the not yet, and the not at all, well, if you're in the hopeless swamps of the not at all, I don't think there's much hope. At any rate, do not let the hero in your soul perish and leave only frustration for the life you deserved, but never have been able to reach. And so there's something echoes in her readers. Yes, I deserve better than this. And she's on my side. And she's telling me I can do it. And nobody else is telling me I can do it. Another quote. Do not let your fire go out. Spark by irreplaceable spark. And this one. The world you desire can be won. It exists. It is real. It is possible. It is yours. I think she would have done well on Madison Avenue. Because Madison Avenue deals with fantasies. Ask yourself whether the dream of heaven and greatness should be waiting for us in our graves, or whether it should be ours here and now and on this earth. Well, there's nothing about religion that says heaven is waiting for you 6 feet under the earth. Heaven doesn't lie waiting for you in a grave. And of course, she's creating a straw man on that level. But she's saying, don't believe in anything but yourself, and you can do it. Achievement and your happiness is the only moral purpose of your life, and that happiness, not pain or mindless self-indulgence, is the proof of your moral integrity, since it is the proof and the result of your loyalty to the achievement of your values. And finally, a little bit about the government. Government help to business is just as disastrous as government persecution. The only way a government can be of service to national prosperity is by keeping its hands off. Government help is just as disastrous as government persecution, so the government should keep its hands off. Now, I find something that all these quotations have in common, and in my own thinking about it, I've come to this conclusion. I don't enjoy cartoons. I haven't for some time, and if I'm switching channels and there's a cartoon on, I just keep switching channels. But when my children were very young, I enjoyed cartoons, watching cartoons with my children. The children would laugh and they would have a great time watching these cartoons. They would sit on my lap and they'd be looking up at me to make sure I'm smiling with them. And it was so wonderful to see the attractiveness of these cartoons through the eyes and the hearts of my little children, returning to that world of innocence where everything is either 100% good or 100% bad, where life is fundamentally simple, and on and on. And then the children grow up and I'd lose my interest in cartoons. The children got to be too big to sit on my lap. But then I found I was doing the same thing with my grandchildren. Grandchildren are sitting in my lap and we're watching Pinocchio, and they're enthralled and they're happy and they're laughing. And I'm seeing again this return to innocence and simplicity. And I enjoy the cartoons through the hearts of my grandchildren. And the grandchildren are still children. There are 12 of them now, and the eldest is just 9. So, I don't know if all 9 can fit on my lap. But the latest are twins that arrived October the 21st. So we're having a good time with the 5 children and the 12 grandchildren. Now, what am I saying about cartoons? You can return to enjoy cartoons with your children and your grandchildren, But what happens if you don't have children or grandchildren? Well, you can return to the world of cartoons through Ayn Rand. Have Ayn Rand sit on your lap in one of her books. And through the mind of Ayn Rand, she returns you to a world of simplicity. A world in which there's a hero in you, like Jack and the Beanstalk, and ogres don't really count. I mean, you're going to take care of the ogre. Where you can do wonderful, extraordinary things because you're a hero and you're divinely blessed and you have this exceptional destiny. Ayn Rand on your lap, reading Ayn Rand, and you return to this world of simplicity, which is very, very, very appealing. So I think much of what Ayn Rand is doing is the comic strip, the cartoon technique for the next generation without the children or grandchildren on your lap. So I had that feeling reading Ayn Rand that this is like a cartoon world, and I don't enjoy it because I would enjoy it if I were young or if my children or grandchildren were with me, but I don't enjoy it with Ayn Rand. At any rate, at least a tentative solution that I've come up with as to how someone who really doesn't have anything substantial to offer has immense appeal. In the movie, I think Network is the name of the movie, this one particular person had become absorbed by the media and seemed to live without any hint of human wisdom. And a comment was made, the scriptwriter was Patty Chayefsky. Oh, don't bother her, she grew up with Bugs Bunny. And she's still Bugs Bunny. At a certain time, I guess we have to reach for something more substantial than what's offered in cartoons. Cartoons are wonderful for children, but we should outgrow them. Well, anthropology. What kind of concept does Ayn Rand have concerning the human being? Well, the human being is a strict individual. Her first novel is called The Anthem, and you get a good sense of what she means by the individual. She grew up in Russia and was horrified about the oppression of the individual in communist Russia. So she wrote this satirical book, Anthem, in which she suppresses the use of the first person I until she gets to the very end of the book. And then she revolts and lets out what she really thinks. For the coming of that day shall I fight, I and my sons and my chosen friends, for the freedom of man, for his rights, for his life, for his honor. And here over the portals of my fort, I shall cut in the stone the word, which is to be my beacon and my banner. The word which will not die, should we all perish in battle. The word which can never die on this earth, for it is the heart of it, and the meaning and the glory, the sacred word, ego. And that's how it ends. That's good. It's very dramatic, a bit of hyperbole, and it's consistent with Ayn Rand all the way through, using words in a very dramatic kind of way, but alluding to a world that's not quite real, a world that is very, very simple, of a kind of cartoon type of substance. The will alone is able to get us through life. The importance of choice. And it's interesting to speculate the impact that Ayn Rand's thinking has on the pro-choice movement. Consider this passage from one of her novels. Man has to be man by choice. He has to hold his life as a value by choice. He has to learn to sustain it by choice. He has to discover the values it requires and practice his virtues by choice. A code of values accepted by choice is the code of morality. Choice, choice, choice. It does make things simple, doesn't it? Choice. Do not be concerned about the consequences of choice. Do not be concerned about the fact that you may have separated choice from goodness, choice from any number of things, choice from reason, choice from freedom, choice that might hurt other people. But everything by choice. You have over 7 million people reading Atlas Shrugged and millions of people reading her other books, and it's plausible that she has influenced this pro-choice mentality, reduce a rather complex situation to a single word, choice. So her concept of the person, the individual, is simply that. John Galt is the hero of Atlas Shrugged. She wrote Atlas Shrugged in 1957, and it's well over 1,000 pages. The first sentence in Atlas Shrugged is, "Who is John Galt?" He's a mystery man. John Galt appears, John Galt has left the world and has gone off into the mountains with other providers, other super people, the people who are the motor of the world. They're tired of carrying the dead weight of 99% of humanity. So they said, that's it. We're going in hiding and let the world collapse. Now, this is a key to the meaning of the title, Atlas Shrugged. There's a conversation between two people in the novel, and one says to the other, all right, suppose you're the Titan, Atlas, and you're carrying the world, and you got blood coming down your face, blood and sweat and pain and agony, and you've been going on for years and years and years carrying the world. If you could do what you wanted to do, what would you do? And the fellow says, I'd shrug. And then the world crashes. So the world crashes because it's lost that 1% of the providers, the super people, the heroes, the extraordinary people. John Galt comes out of the mountains. This is very much like Nietzsche, and thus sprach Zarathustra, where, coming down from the mountain, and that's sort of a holiness coming down from Olympus and bringing this great philosophy. John Galt comes out of the mountains, and he addresses humanity. Now, in Atlas Shrugged, it's 58 pages long. It's a radio address. I'm John Galt, and this is what I want to tell you. He goes on and on and on for 58 pages in fine print. Ayn Rand produced another book a few years later called The New Left, which has slightly larger print, and John Galt's speech is 77 pages, part of 1,075 pages in the book. And everybody's listening to this. I mean, people are attached to their radios, and they listen to a 58-page speech without turning the radio off, and they're thoroughly impressed. So this is it. We're all individuals, and we have to be individuals. So at the end of his speech, he says, I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another person, nor ask another person to live for mine. Now, when Bennett Cerf was dealing with Ayn Rand concerning Random House's publication of Atlas Shrugged, Bennett Cerf said, well, don't you think a 58-page speech is a little bit long? I mean, are people going to be listening to a 58-page speech? And she looked at him and growled, and she said, would you cut the Bible? So Bennett Cerf caved in, all right, a 58-page speech, and everybody listens to it. John Galt concludes his speech by cutting a $sign in the air over the desolate land. Money is the barometer of a society's health. It's kind of a mockery of the Pope, who will bless people in the name of the Father and the Son. But instead of cutting a sign of the cross, he has John Galt cut the $sign. Ayn Rand arranged that a 6-foot $sign decorate her coffin. Concerning human relations, the essence of her thinking is this, as she says, altruism is the root of all evil. Altruism is the root of all evil. The Ayn Rand Society and Institute wants to end volunteerism, because volunteerism represents helping others and not getting paid for it and diminishing your own individuality. Now, the odd thing is that volunteers are recruited so that they can stamp out volunteering. So we need volunteers. Good, I'm a volunteer. Okay, what do I do? Stamp out volunteering. Okay, I resign. It's a bit contradictory and kind of amusing. Volunteers who are dedicated to stamping out volunteerism, Meals on Wheels and all that. So this gets into the high schools, and she's got people running around trying to put an end to volunteerism, but they are themselves volunteers. When Ayn Rand was, maybe 10 years old or so, she was utterly mesmerized by the image, it was a drawing, of an extraordinary man, a heroic kind of man, and that never left her. In 1926, speaking of Chicago, a 21-year-old lady by the name of Alice Rosenbaum, she arrived in Chicago with $50 in her pocket, and she got a job stuffing envelopes. But her life didn't end there. She went on to Hollywood, changed her name to Ayn Rand. She took the name Rand from the typewriter, Remington Rand. So every time she looked at the typewriter, she was seeing her image kind of glorified and her future literary accomplishments. She went out to Hollywood, and she was on a film shoot, and she saw this man who was a bit actor, and he had this dazzling profile that reminded her of this image she saw when she was 10 years old. The man was Frank O'Connor, and ultimately they married. He was her hero. Now, Frank O'Connor and Ayn Rand are married, and Ayn Rand teams up with a psychologist by the name of Nathaniel Brandon, and they go on tour, one college after another. Ayn Rand is offering a philosophy of life, and the psychologist Nathaniel Brandon is affirming that this is a healthy kind of life for you psychologically. So this is a nice kind of combination of philosophy and psychological affirmation. Selfishness is good for you. You should be as selfish as possible. It's very good for you. And as a psychologist, I can tell you that. Be an individual, don't live for anybody else. So it's kind of a successful tour. They were doing this in the 60s, and people were talking about it. So inevitably, Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Brandon have an affair, and they want to be upfront about this with respect to their spouses. So they approach their spouses and say, well, we're individuals, and we have the right to do whatever we want to do, and we've decided to have an affair. Well, Frank O'Connor found comfort in alcohol, and Barbara Brandon, Nathaniel's wife, began having severe panic attacks. So this infidelity didn't set well with them. Not long after that, Nathaniel had an affair with his younger and much more attractive secretary. And when Ayn Rand discovered that, she flew into a rage. And Nathaniel said, well, it was a lesser value. So I still regard you as a higher value, speaking in the language of Ayn Rand. And she says it has nothing to do with the lesser value. How dare you speak to me of a lesser value? All of this comes out in Barbara Brandon's book, The Passion of Ayn Rand. Barbara is the jilted wife, the wife of Nathaniel Brandon. I don't know if she had a tape recorder present or she had a very good memory, but Ayn Rand says to Nathaniel, how dare you speak to me of a lesser value? It's not an issue of that, it's far worse. That girl is nothing. And then she ritualistically slaps Nathaniel Brandon across the face 3 times and orders him out of her life. But before he leaves, she has this to say to him. It's finished, your whole act. I'll tear you down. I'll tear down your facade as I built it up. I'll denounce you publicly. I'll destroy you as I created you. Or the name, or the wealth, or the prestige. You'll have nothing, just as you started, just as you came to me, just as you would have remained without me. You would have accomplished nothing if I hadn't handed you my life. I did it all. You dared to reject me. Which is pretty complete, but she doesn't sound like an individualistic individual, because she doesn't say, well, Nathaniel, you have the right to do whatever you jolly well please. Who am I to criticize? And she is younger and she is more attractive. Okay, lots of luck. And I do that myself, so we're all individuals, and why should I be upset? One reviewer of Barbara Brandon's book said, this is great, I can't wait for the opera. And then finally she says to him, if you have an ounce of morality left in you, an ounce of psychological health, you shall be impotent for the next 20 years, and if you achieve any potency, you'll know it's a sign of still worse moral degradation. So out he goes. Now, I've seen Ayn Rand on television many times. Johnny Carson show, Mike Wallace, Tom Snyder, Phil Donahue. She was interviewed in Playboy by Alvin Toffler. In 1959, an interview on television with Mike Douglas. And Mike Douglas says, well, I've been reading your works, and you say that it's not a good thing to love your neighbor. And he says, what's wrong with loving your neighbor? And she said, most people are not worth being loved. They don't have any value. They're not worth being loved. Now, and Mike Wallace is a bit stunned. This is pretty much the way it goes with all of the people who interviewed her. They're all kind of stunned. You mean there are people who don't have value and are not worth being loved? Yes. Oh, very interesting. She has large eyes that express great fear. I remember catching her on the Johnny Carson show, and she refused to take any questions from the audience. Here she is, Ayn Rand, and she's going to say a few things, and nobody's allowed to ask a question. And then I read in Time magazine that she was speaking at West Point, and I'm trying to figure out, well, why would West Point invite Ayn Rand to speak there? In Atlas Shrugged, she arranges for a catastrophic train accident in a tunnel, and everyone is killed. Everyone in the train accident is killed. And she knows the character of each of these people, so we get a sense of why these people deserve to be killed. Traveling in car number 1 was a sociologist who taught that individual abilities are of no consequence. So that person deserved to die. In car number 2 was a journalist who believed that it was proper to use compulsion for a good cause. In car number 3 was an elderly school teacher who taught her students that the will of the majority is the only standard of good and evil. Car number 4 carried a newspaper publisher who believed that men are evil by nature, and so on. You can kind of see Auguste Comte, Karl Marx, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, and others. Philosophers should refute ideas rather than exterminate people. But I think Ayn Rand had fun exterminating people who are carriers of ideas. And people who have studied this passage and made interesting comments say, well, this is typical of Ayn Rand. She doesn't really see human beings as human beings. She sees them as carriers of ideas. And if they have bad ideas, they should go. They have no value. You don't try to talk to them. You don't try to educate them. You don't try to love them. You look at them and say, get out of here. So she must have had great fun killing all of these people in the train accident. Well, I don't want to go too long, but I do want to touch upon a few of these things. The notion of reason, man is purely rational, and Atlas Shrugged describes the role of man's mind in existence. He's a totally rational person, and there's no room for faith and so forth. But Ayn Rand is a very, very emotional person. When she passed away, William F. Buckley wrote a column dedicated to her, and rather mistakenly, he said, Ayn Rand has passed, and so has her philosophy. Well, not quite. But then he recounted an episode in which someone said something mildly critical about her philosophy, and she broke into tears. And I think Ludwig von Mises was there, the Austrian economist, and said, "You're acting like a little Jewish girl." And then she cried even more. But she was a very emotional person, and we can't navigate through life through reason alone. But I think maybe the most important point I want to make has to do with logic. Ayn Rand said, I am the second greatest philosopher who ever lived. The first being Aristotle. And nobody else counts. There's Aristotle, and then there's me. Aristotle founded logic. A equals A, existence equals existence. So there it is. And she was once asked if she could present her whole philosophy standing on one foot. I'm standing on one foot. Says, yes, metaphysics, objective reality, epistemology, reason, ethics, self-interest, and politics, capitalism. That's it. That's my whole philosophy in a nutshell. Very simple. At any rate, I don't think she knew much about Aristotle. Atlas Shrugged is divided into three or four Aristotelian sections, either or, A equals A, principle of non-contradiction. So she's interviewed by Alvin Toffler, and she says that if communism is bad, then sheer individualism must be good. And Alvin Toffler asked her to repeat that a few times because he didn't think it made a whole lot of sense. Now, if you know a little bit about Aristotle, and I guess many of you have taken Aristotelian logic, maybe as a freshman, Aristotle is a marvelous logician, and he's very keenly aware of different kinds of oppositions. They have a square of opposition. If you take the word mother, for example, mother and daughter, those would be opposites, but it's a particular kind of opposition called relation, mother-daughter relation. A mother and a barren woman who cannot be a mother, that's a relation of privation. She's deprived of being a mother. Mother and non-mother would be a different kind of opposition. It's called contradiction. Everything in the world is either a mother or a non-mother. I'm a non-mother. If A is true, B is false. If A is false, B is true. So they're perfectly polar opposites. There are a couple of other oppositions, but the one I want to point out that's very important is contrariety. Mother and father. Mother and daughter, mother and non-mother, mother and barren woman, mother and father. Mother and father are contraries. So that if one is false, the other could be false too. In other words, if someone is not a mother, that person could also not be a father. I mean, none of my grandchildren are either mothers or fathers. This is what Ayn Rand doesn't seem to understand. She treats contraries as if they were contradictories. And by rejecting one, she feels logically obliged, in the spirit of Aristotle, to affirm the other. But she makes a couple of critical mistakes that are not only logical, but something else. If communism under Stalin is wrong, that doesn't mean that sheer radical individualism of the Ayn Rand variety must be right because the two are contradictories. The two are really contraries. And this is what John Paul II was trying to achieve in his most philosophical book, The Acting Person, which people find very difficult to understand. And I said, well, it's very simple if you understand what he's doing. He's explaining on the one hand that communism is not quite true, does not quite do justice to the human being, because the human being is more than simply a member of the collective. But on the other hand, the philosophy of René Descartes, I think, therefore I am, radical individualism, is also wrong. They're both wrong. And they're both wrong because they're both right, which seems kind of odd. In other words, Marxism is not 100% wrong. Nothing is 100% wrong, as a matter of fact. The one thing that's right about Marxism and even communism is that the human being is a member of society, but it's incomplete. The other thing that's true about man is that he is an individual with unique abilities. And the thing we have to do in order to understand what a human being is to understand that dynamic integration of unique individuality and social responsibility. And this is why John Paul II is regarded as a personalist philosopher, because he takes something good from the notion of membership, something good from the notion of individuality, and he blends them together in a dynamic way to form a person. So it's the person that's true, not that either of those other extremes are 100% false. But you think of things being 100% this or 100% that. The error that goes with that is an error that goes back to Hegel, to think of people as members of a class in the first place. We're all individuals and we're all members of a class, I suppose, in a certain sense. But to think of people homogeneously associated with a class is to do injustice to all human beings. Ayn Rand takes something from Marxism that she really perhaps doesn't understand that she really takes. The notion that it is fair to divide people into classes, the ruling class or the working class. Ayn Rand turns Marxism on its head. She's the inversion of Marxism. It's interesting, when we try to label things, identify things. How do we identify, let's say, the 1% of Americans who pay maybe 70% of the taxes? Ayn Rand would say they are the providers. Marx would say they are the oppressors. Are they providers or oppressors? 100% one, 100% of the other? Isn't it more reasonable to say, well, they're all individual human beings, and it's kind of a mixture of all kinds of things. Some of them are very generous, and some of them are very selfish. Just because they belong to a certain arbitrary class doesn't mean they're identical. So let's not put people in classes in the first place. That's the first mistake. The second mistake is to think that opposite classes are contradictories when they are really contraries. A contrary can be false, and the other one could also be false. Just to complete things a little bit, the last point I wanted to allude to was reality. Paul Krugman, who's won a Nobel Prize, says that Atlas Shrugged is a childish fantasy that often engenders a lifelong obsession with its unbelievable heroes, leading to an emotionally stunted, socially crippled adulthood, unable to deal with the real world. Wow, I think it's devastating, and I think it's rather accurate. I just want to read a short passage from Benedict XVI when he was Cardinal Ratzinger. I think it might have predated being cardinal. In 1985, the Ratzinger report came out, and Joseph Ratzinger said this, which is rather interesting. Economic liberalism creates its own exact counterpart, permissivism, on the moral plane. The economic and the moral are connected to each other. You can't sever them. You can't have economics apart from morality. Economics has an impact on morality. So economic liberalism creates its exact counterpart, permissivism, on the moral plane. In a world like the West, where money and wealth are the measure of all things, it sounds like Ayn Rand, money is the barometer of the health of a society, and where the model of the free market imposes its implacable laws on every aspect of life, authentic Catholic ethics now appears to many as an alien body from times long past, as a kind of meteorite which is in opposition not only to the concrete habits of life, but also to the way of thinking underlying them. That's very interesting. He's saying this in 1985. It's almost as if he had read Ayn Rand and said, well, if you go that way, everything's going to fall apart. Economics is deeply significant. The word economics, of course, goes back to ekonimos, the Greek word for the household, and that demands some kind of interesting integration and balance of things. So a few things. Have I exhausted my time period? I don't want to prevent you from asking a few questions. As I say, Ayn Rand is a fabulous phenomenon. You can't avoid her. She's out there. 7 million copies of Atlas Shrugged, 400,000 books donated to high school students every year just from the Ayn Rand Society. She's a phenomenon that can't be neglected. But she's a fabulous phenomenon because she weaves fables, and she enchants people with her magic flute, and she plays upon the affinity that immature people have for believing that cartoons represent reality. I think that's where her appeal is. I think as one becomes a little mature and realizes that life is difficult and that life is a way of the cross, they put away Ayn Rand and say, I think I've grown up a little bit, that what she has to say has made her a nice, comfortable living monetarily, but it doesn't work. It's the cartoon for the next age group. But I suppose we have a lot of people who feel oppressed, and they're looking for liberation. I suppose Marx had the same appeal. I will liberate you, join the revolution, you have nothing to lose but your chains. Ayn Rand is saying something similar, even though she's the opposite of Marx. But as I implied, she and Marx are actually profoundly tied into each other, much as she opposes Marx, because they both believe that human beings can be understood in terms of classes rather than persons. So we have this wonderful contribution of people like Martin Buber and Jacques Maritain, Emmanuel Mounier, Nikolai Berdyaev, John Paul II. A human being is a person. He's not simply a member of a collective, and he's not simply a radical individual. He's a unique individual with social responsibilities, and these two qualities are brought together in a unique, dynamic kind of integrity. And this is the great challenge of a human being, to really be a person. And as one is a person, one isn't really part of the class of persons exactly, because everyone is a person in a different way. Some people are able to be more generous to others, and some people are able to love others, and everybody's capable and eligible for love. So thank you to Lumen Christi, and to all of the people who are very much involved in bringing me out here. There's a lot I feel is left unsaid, but maybe I've said enough. Ayn Rand is a fabulous phenomenon, but she wears thin as a person becomes mature. I'd rather say positive things about people, but it does give me a chance to say something positive about the personalism of John Paul II. The Acting Person's not selling 7 million copies. It's a wonderful book. John Paul has the mind of a surgeon, making all these wonderful distinctions, but they're always connected with reality. And he's writing at the University of Lublin, the only Catholic university that the communist state is allowed to exist at that time in Poland. So he's very much concerned about not offending the powers to be. So this adds to the complexity of his language, I suppose. But he's doing what needs to be done. It'd be a wonderful thing, I suppose, to get this notion of person going instead of this notion of simply being an individual who can choose whatever he wants to choose. So thank you again, and if we have questions, I'd be very happy to, as they say, field questions. I won't be able to answer them, maybe, but field them.